Good morning, Garutara Sanghyavansaking Avasarai, Honorable Chairperson, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. This gathering honors the legacy of Dr. Roland Silva, the visionary who transformed heritage preservation in Sri Lanka. The theme Beyond Dr. Roland Silva reminds us that our task is not only to remember his achievements, but to build upon them with new insight, commitment and courage. In that same spirit of legacy, I turn briefly to my own journey, one that began far from archaeology. My journey began in the operating theatre where precision was absolute. In 1992, I performed Sri Lanka's first laparoscopic cholecystectomy, a moment that proved innovation can transform practice. Little did I know that same pursuit of precision would one day lead me beyond surgery into the forgotten measures of our history. I built laparoscopic simulators, training center, and established international collaborations, all with one belief: to pass knowledge to the next generation. That same belief years later would guide me towards another kind of preservation, our history. During the COVID lockdown, I finally began opening my own library, books I had collected for years but never read with my busy surgical life. This reminded me of that song, Potata Kaling Hamadamat Pitakavar Baluwe. But among those long unopened pages, I discovered something unsettling. Our historical measurements no longer matched the descriptions. That realization led me back, not to the operating theatre, but to the classroom. So I returned to the study. After decades in surgery, walked back into the classroom, humbled and curious, not to teach, but to learn. Immersed myself in archaeology, epigraphy, Sanskrit, and oral leaf manuscripts, seeking clarity within forgotten knowledge. I became a student once again, looking for what our text had lost, also searching for truth buried within our own heritage. And then I found it, or rather, I realized what was missing. Our essential unit, the MITI, had quietly vanished. That disappearance is where this research truly began. As I studied our chronicles, I found measurements that simply did not make sense. Buddha's height, dimensions of golden vase which brought Sri Mahabodhi branch, height of sandalwood pyre, all became unrealistic and impossible measurements under the 18-inch RIYANA. These inconsistencies signaled that something was historically wrong. Then I found a line in Sri Sumangala Sabdakosha, Mitamilavu Atehi. That one phrase was enough to suggest that material wasn't a myth, but a real hand measure. When I referred to the Abhidhana Pradipika, I found only the word meter translated as a fist in the Bhumi Vagga section that lists linear measurements. But there was no definition or reference to material. This absence suggested that the unit had already vanished from the literature by the 12th century. I formed a hypothesis that the material was a real 4-inch unit of the early Buddhist period. To verify it, I approached the problem like surgery, through 4 diagnostic questions. Was it real? Why was it lost? When did it disappear? And where did it go in our text? Here I tested the 4-inch material, a trial of application. Under the inflated 18-inch measure, these accounts were impossible. But once recalibrated to 4 inches, they became practical and historically accurate. This is where a hypothesis becomes evidence. But if Mitiriyana made perfect sense, then the question remained, why did it disappear? As a surgeon, I believe in cause and effect, the paticca samuppada. The disappearances is only an effect. So I began searching for the cause. Now that the 4-inch measure has proven historically accurate, the question becomes, why was it lost? To answer that, I had to move beyond numbers into history itself. The disappearances of Mitiriyana was not accidental. It was shaped by many forces: religious transitions, cultural shifts, political upheavals, and social change. Together, these influences caused a literary disappearance. The measure survived in practice but vanished from our text. Understanding this context is vital. Only then can we truly rediscover the measure and restore its meaning. Ladies and gentlemen, to understand how Mitiriyana disappeared, we must travel through time. During the Theravada period, from the 3rd century BC to the 5th century AD, it was a living practical measure, used in daily life, though never formally defined in text. From the 10th to 12th centuries onward, under growing Mahayana and Sanskrit influence, the focus shifted. Classical lexicons like the Abhidhana Padipika and Sri Sumangala Sabdakosha replaced real measures with imitated definitions. Mitiriyana did not vanish overnight. It faded gradually through cultural transition and scholarly neglect. This timeline tells the real story, a measure that survived in practice but disappeared from memory. The disappearance of Mitiriyana was not a single error, it was the outcome of history. Within the Sangha, internal divisions and sectarian disputes weakened the continuity of practices. Meanwhile, political upheavals, invasions, famine, and shift in power disrupted the learned traditions that once preserved knowledge. In this turbulence, practical units like Mitiriyana were forgotten, replaced by copied, imitated definitions. Thus, cultural fracture and political instability together erased a living measurement from our memory. Early chronicles such as Mahavanso and Singhala Bodhivanso mentioned the Riyana, confirming its practical use. Yet, they never defined Mitiriyana, leaving a silence in interpretation, a gap that later scholars misinterpreted. In the 12th century Abhidhana Padipika, the term appears only as the fist, meter, without any measurement context. By then, clarity was already lost. When I examined the 3 all-leaf manuscripts of the Abhidhana Padipika and its Sanna and the Tika preserved in the museum library, I found no mention of Mitiriyana. Only the inflated 18-inch Vaduriyana remained. Clear proof that the practical measure had already faded from scholarly memory. This was the only Pāli dictionary available to British historians, who then relied on it and inherited its errors. Abhidhana Padipika, all a leaf in the Bhumi Vagga section clearly shows Angula, 12 Angula equal 1 Vidatti and 2 Vidatti equal 1 Ratana. British historians later equaled Angula with 1 inch. Crucial misinterpretation that distorted all subsequent measurements. Even in the 19th century, Venerable Sri Sumangala Thera mentioned Mitiriyana but gave no clear definition. Several inconsistent values appear, 18, 24, 25, even 27 inches, reflecting the growing Sanskrit Hindu scholastic influence that clouded earlier precision. Yet, his citation of the Kaccāyana-Vyākaraṇa shows that the term itself still echoed faintly within the Buddhist literary tradition. The Kaccāyana-Vyākaraṇa, a Vinaya commentary on the Patimokkha, provides a strongest textual link to MITI. Quoted in the Sabdakosha, it confirms that this unit was recognized within the canonical commentarial heritage. As E.W. Adhikaram noted in the History of Buddhism in Ceylon, the Kaccāyana-Vyākaraṇa stems from the orthodox Mahayana tradition, anchoring MITI firmly within Theravada continuity. Extended search into later Pāli, Sinhala and Sanskrit works, including Amarakosha, Pāli Akaradhya, Kautalya Arthasastra, Manjusri Vastu Vidya Sastra, Manasara and Mayamata, we find no reference to MITI. This silence across both Buddhist and Hindu scholastic tradition confirms that by the post-Theravada period, the term had vanished from mainstream use. Its absence suggests not that the measure never existed, but that it was forgotten through cultural amnesia. Across centuries, cultural and political shift, the Chola invasion, Mahayana influence, and the Sanskritization of learning gradually eroded our linguistic and intellectual traditions. The MITI was not lost in error, it was forgotten through transformation. In ancient times, all measurements began with the human hand, the most natural and universal scale. But over centuries, textual definition drifted away from practice. That is why textual claims alone are not enough. They must be tested against the proportions of the human body. Only through anthropometric study can historical accuracy return to reality. To verify the ancient units, I conducted an anthropometric study with 50 male surgical trainee surgeons. The results were consistent. One Vidati measured over 9 inches and one Angula about 0.75 inches, not 1 inch as previously assumed. This clearly shows that later scholars had inflated the traditional scale. Most importantly, early Pāli terms such as Ratana, Kukku and Hatto all refer to the same hand span unit, confirming a living and coherent measurement tradition. When tested on real hands, the truth measured itself. Even in the early 20th century, the unit quietly survived. In 1905, school arithmetic book records a clear conversion for angulas equal 1 meter, a 4-inch hand measure. This demonstrates that MITI never vanished. It merely slipped from scholarly practice while remaining alive in practice. Portuguese records from Baticulo Fort mention a unit called palm, derived from the width of the human hand. This shows the continuation of the MITI through adaptation, from MITI to Hatta and finally to the colonial palm. The continuation of Vittipot and Leka MITI as Tombu during Portuguese period is another strong example of this enduring tradition during Portuguese period. The Baticulo Fort provides the clearest surviving examples of the ancient 4-inch hand-based measure. While the wall height of 35 palms matches the MITI scale, later Dutch reconstruction widened part of the wall, explaining slight variation. Ladies and gentlemen, to sum up this study, the 4-inch MITI in use since the 3rd century BC has now been authenticated by correcting canonical measurement. It disappeared between the 10th and 12th centuries amid cultural and scholastic transitions. Continuity is traceable through colonial palm and 1905 school text. This study re-establishes its authenticity and invites further research to refine Sri Lanka's historical measurements. Ladies and gentlemen, as a surgeon, precision defined my craft. As a student of history, it became my measure. Through MITI, I believe we have measured not just distance, but the depth of our own heritage. This journey was never just about a lost unit of measure. It was about rediscovering a forgotten truth. The MITI reminds us that even in the smallest measure lies the story of an entire civilization. Thank you for joining me in this journey to protect what was almost forgotten.